Today we learned Lesson 1-9, which was Order of Operations and Distributive Property. Learning target was to use the distributive property in order of operations. If you'd like to follow along, you can turn your book to page 49. These things need to be filled in on your notes, and hopefully you have a copy of those in front of you. Now, this should be a review. We've been learning about PEMDAS and Order of Operations for probably a few years now. You've heard PEMDAS thrown around a lot, and just a review of what all of those stand for, and this is something you should fill in on your notes. The P stands for parentheses, E for exponents, M for multiplication, D for division, A for addition, and S is for subtraction. You might see it written in your classrooms a lot as PEMDAS. You might even have a little acronym made up to remember it, and I will share with you mine. It's a silly one, and one that I was taught, I think, in 5th grade, and I've never forgot it since because it was funny to me, and I remember things that are funny, so hopefully you'll remember it as well. Now, the reason that we remember parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction is because this tells us the order in which to operate our math. So if we have a problem with a lot of processes in it, then you will have to remember PEMDAS and do things in this order. You always work with the parentheses first, then you work with your exponents, then you do any multiplication, then you do division, then addition, and then subtraction. Now, the little acronym that I've remembered since I was in 5th grade is to pee every morning during a shower. Now, this always helps me remember the P, parentheses, every, exponents, morning, multiplication, during, division, A, addition, shower, subtraction. You have to come up with your own way to remember, because if you don't think mine's funny, then you might not remember, but you might be able to think of your own that you think is funny. So think of an acronym that you think is funny and things and how you want to remember it, and go ahead and write that in your notes. Now, distributive property is the next thing we're going to talk about. So the distributive property, I wrote out 3 different examples. We have addition and subtraction, and sometimes no number at all at the outside of a parenthesis. When we are doing distributive property, we have to think of passing out the number to everybody inside the parentheses before you can do anything. So for example, 9 times 4 plus 5. You can follow order of operations and do parentheses first and get 9 times 9, which would be 81. But what distributive property teaches us, and we will use this in pre-algebra and algebra, is that we need to pass out what's outside of the parentheses before we can move on. So just like 9 times 9 is 81, the other way to do that using distributive property is to multiply 9 times 4, which is taking this 9 and giving it to the 4, and we're multiplying because 9 is up against the parentheses, which we know that means multiplication, and then adding it to 9 to the positive 5. So we're adding 9 times 5. And you would get 9 times 4 is 36 plus 45, which happens to be 81. It's the same answer as if you would have used order of operations. Now, the other example is subtraction. 5 multiplied by 8 minus 2. If you look at this, it's the same as taking your 5 and passing it out. You have to first pass it out to the 8. So it'll be 5 times 8. I'm going to keep my sign the same, and I'm going to pass the 5 to the 2, which would be multiplied by 2. You would get an answer if you were using distributive property of 5 times 6, which would be 30. Or you can do it the other way of doing 5 times 8, which is 40, minus 5 times 2, which is 10, and you also get an answer of 30. Now, when you distribute the negative sign, you might see something like this along the line somewhere. You might even have a 5 in front of here. You can't be confused. You need to remember that a negative is the same as saying -1. Always, it's the same as saying -1. So what you have to do is pass out this negative sign. So first you have to get the negative to the 2, and it would become -2, and then you have to get the negative to the 3, and this is a +3, so it will become -3. Okay, so I'd end up with -2 minus 3, which we know is -5. And if I were to do this with distributive property, I would get a -5. So if you were in class today, you were able to do a lot more hands-on things with this and figure this out. If this concept kind of freaks you out, we'll go over it more a little bit when we do some of the examples. Okay, the first example from your notes is 7 multiplied by -4 plus 2. There are two ways to do this problem. You can do it using PEMDAS, or you can do it using distributive property. So we're going to do it both ways. With PEMDAS, we know the parentheses tells us to do what's inside the parentheses first. -4 plus 2 is -2. Different signs subtract, keep the bigger sign. Multiplied by 7. 7 times -2, a good thing happens to a bad guy. It's a bad thing, would be -14. If I use distributive property, I get 7. I'm going to pass this out. I'm going to change the color here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to pass out the 7. First to the -4. 7 times -4 would be -28. And then to the +2. And I would get +14. This is a +14, so I'm going to put a plus here. So I have different signs, so I'm going to subtract, and I'm going to keep the sign that's larger. 28 is larger, so that are the larger absolute, so the answer would be -14. You can see it doesn't matter which way you solve these. You can either solve using PEMDAS, or you can solve using distributive property. I'm just going to initial that DP. All right, our next example is -40 divided by 4 plus 2 times 5. Now, there are no parentheses in this one, so using distributive property is out of the question this time. I probably should have mentioned that using distributive property is when you have parentheses. So we'll have to follow PEMDAS here. So I like to do this on my paper sometimes. Write out PEMDAS so I can go through each step. We know there's no parentheses. There are no exponents. Multiplication. If you see here, there's some multiplication. This is a +2 because that's the sign next to it. So I'm going to multiply +2 times +5, which is 10. And I don't want you guys to be confused by that line. It's not a fraction, so I'm going to write 10 here. Okay, I'm done with multiplication. Division. -40 divided by 4 would be -10. This is a +10, so I'm going to put a plus here. And remember, I can just also bring down this plus sign. -10 plus 10 would be 0, and that would be your answer. I'm going to do one more example with you, and then I would like you to do the last 3 on your own, and I can give you the answers. So the next one is 30 divided by 3 plus 2 times 6. I'm going to do the same thing. Find a place on my paper to write PEMDAS so I can go through. Parentheses is first. There's nothing to distribute because all that's next to it is a division sign. You can only distribute negative signs, not operation signs. Okay, so I'm going to do the parentheses first. 5 plus 2 is 5. I'm going to bring down everything so I can see what I'm doing. Bring down the division sign, bring down the 30. Done with parentheses. There are no exponents. Next is multiplication. 5 times 6 is 30. I'm going to bring down my 30, bring down my division sign. Next is division. 30 divided by 30 happens to be 1, and there's no addition and no subtraction. So my answer would be 1. So why don't you take a minute now and do the last 3 problems on the notes. If you don't have the notes, then in a minute you'll be able to go forward and just look for the answers there or look for the questions and do them on your own.